Good afternoon, everybody. I think we're ready to go. Welcome. I now have a very important task to do, meaning keeping you awake after lunch. And that's the same for our trainers. Don't laugh, Stefan, I see you there. Welcome, everybody. So welcome to the day one of our training, Sustainability and Carbon Emissions Accounting for Vehicle Logistics. We are around 100 people in the room. It's nice to see that so many of you joined. So let's get started. First of all, as you know, this training is free of charge for ECG members. We owe you as an association also to support you in this, and it was fully funded through by ECG, but also thanks to our two sponsors who are also here in the room today. Gold sponsor is Transporting Wheels. You will get to know them a little bit later. And Inform as well. There is Ruud here somewhere in the room. You will meet him for sure during these 2 days of training. Why are we here today? I think that's pretty clear, but why is another why. So why are we doing this training? The history starts in 2020, history of our work with emissions reporting and calculations in vehicle logistics. But for the sake of time and not to help you in falling asleep, I just summarized a little bit here on this slide. So throughout 2023, we ran a project in ECG where we published this guideline that you can see here, Emissions Calculation and Reporting Guideline for Automotive Supply Chains. This was published in December last year after many months of work where we decided to define a common methodology for our sector to calculate and report on emissions. This is compliant with current standards on the matter, but it's really an interpretation and a tool for you to apply and use data that you have to calculate your emissions, which ultimately you will report to your customers and hopefully which will support you in your decarbonization journeys. I just wanted to mention briefly who was part of this project and who supported us, the company supporting us, and especially the people as well who dedicated time and resources. So you can see them on the screen. We had OEM representatives, LSP representatives, and other companies supporting us, including ITCL. You will hear about them later. They were our consultants and still are throughout the project and supporting also with the training today. And also one of our partners was the VDA, so German Automobile Manufacturers Association, who couldn't be here today, but sends regards, of course. As I said, phase one was concluded. We did the guideline, which I hope all of you have read before coming here today. Please say yes. Yes. Okay. Moving on, we are doing a phase two, and there are mainly 3 activities now going on. First, pilots, guideline update, and training. If we look at the pilots, this is one of the activity streams that we are carrying on. We wanted to see how the guideline works in practice. So is it applicable? What are the main challenges? And so on. You can see the current 5 pilots ongoing. Stefan, I hope they're still all ongoing. I think so. And the different phases that they are in. Guideline update. Many of you here today are sustainability managers. You know that standards, emissions is an ever-evolving topic, so we always need to know what's going on, and we basically took the guideline and understood that some topics needed to be updated for the different modes of transport that we are covering, so road, rail, and ship. Plus, we added some works on, for example, book and claim, which is also a very interesting topic nowadays. And the training, of course, you know all about it, or you will know all about it during today and tomorrow. If you are new to this work stream that ECG has and you would like to participate, support, give your contribution, you can still do that. Please reach out to me. And now about the training. So you have received this information. We are going to embark on a journey which will last more or less 2 days with some lunch and dinner and so on. The agenda you have here. So day one, we will all be in the same room here. You will have different modules presented. It will be a general introduction to the guideline that will also go into the detail of its specifications and concepts. Day two, which is happening tomorrow from 9 until lunchtime, will be a little bit different, meaning we will have 4 sessions, well, 4 presentations, so to say, with 2 sessions, but we will tell you more about this tomorrow and how it will work. Also, very special thanks to the trainers who are here today and who engaged with us to create this training and to deliver presentations. When we decided to make the training, we said it's very important that this training is delivered also by people who are working in the sector, who understand Finnish vehicle logistics, who know how a truck is loaded or how a ship is loaded, and that's really important to us. And we couldn't have done it without our members who support this work. Just a little information about later. We will finish at around 6, maybe 5:30, depends on the questions you will have throughout the day. And dinner will start here outside of the room, where we also had lunch at 7 p.m., so 1900. Oh, before we move on, I just wanted to highlight that ECG also has some other training opportunities. Here, the negotiation management course that we have just relaunched, taking place in January and March next year. The dates are fixed. If you scan the QR code and you are interested in scaling up your negotiation skills with a 2-day training, you can do that. And if you have questions, you can catch me or my other colleagues who are in the room for more information. Let's get started. So, emissions journey. Training consists of 2 blocks. We've already said that. You received it in the material that I was emailing to you in the past weeks. Most of you, I think, are attending both of the days. We thought we would organize one day with general introduction and one day maybe with more for experts in calculations, but most of you are attending both days. Day one, as I said, it's really to introduce you to the guideline, to give you some examples, to take you through the general principles of the guideline. And I will be the trainer of your first module. The first module of today is really to tell you why we are doing it. Why is emissions calculation and reporting important? And also it will introduce you to the main challenges that we have seen so far when dealing with the guidelines. But first, we will start with some warm-up. So take out your phones, please scan the QR code, and let's get to know you better. First question is, what is your position or job title? We want to see who is in the room today. Of course, the training is for mostly sustainability managers, calculation experts, but also what we said, the topic should be known by everybody in a company who has to meet with customers, who's discussing with customers, because it can be a quite tricky topic at times. It requires a lot of technical knowledge. And we see really as a target audience a lot of possible figures within the companies that are from our members. Okay, I see a lot of sustainability, ESG, semi-retired. Mike, thank you for that. I see some IT people, some operations, decarbonization, that's an interesting title. You can share about how you're doing it maybe later. Okay, thank you very much. I think that's enough for our analysis post-event. Second question, who is your employer? Who do you work for? Don't say your wife, please. This will help you also with your networking later. You can see what companies you want to meet. I have to say that, whoa, Toyota Motor Europe, how many are you? Of course, you are down the road, so 5. So just to tell you, we have today 100 people in the room, and they come from around 55, 56 companies. Okay, now let's go into the topic. Tell us about calculation of emissions in your own companies. Do you do it now? Will you do it in the future? You have no clue. You're here and you're thinking, what is emissions? Hopefully not. After that, this will be fixed. So I think we're quite happy to see that the majority is already performing calculations. Great. The follow-up question could be, are you using the ECG guideline? Let's see. Maybe at the next training. And this 1%, maybe we can talk later. That's Mike? Okay. Mike is always distorting our analysis. Okay, thank you for that. Do you personally have experience in emissions calculation? That's to understand how many of you here really have to deal with the data, with the nitty-gritty operations. Some experience. You can be a little bit more specific maybe next time than some experience. Okay. So less than 50% have some experience. Yeah, okay. And then the question. Mike, we know you haven't. No, I'm joking. Mike has read it many times. So, exactly. So, there is no option because that's not an option. Okay, the 36% will get extra beers tonight. The rest, you can go to your rooms and read. Okay, so only briefly browse through. We have a very clear target that by the end of the training, you will go home and you say, I have to read it. Okay, now we are on after the fun part, we get to the serious part, so to say. We have worked for many years on this topic. We published the guidelines, so we try to summarize the challenges that we currently see in the decarbonization of freight transport. Of course, calculating emissions is not there for the sake of doing it, right? The ultimate objective is to bring down the emissions that our sector produce and the wider transport sector. The challenge that we see is the low willingness to pay for sustainability. I will not open a debate on that because there would be a lot to say. But the approach to overcome that challenge is to, of course, raise awareness, talk about it with your customers, and also define the long-term benefits and envisage them together. Second is the availability of low carbon fuels. So, and that's tricky, right? Because if there are not a lot, the demand is high, then the approach is, of course, to stimulate demand and have that scaling up that is needed in order for these fuels to be available. Third, suppliers' commitment. So what is your commitment to decarbonizing? Do you have a branding saying, I have a roadmap to decarbonize by 40% by 2030? These targets that we hear a lot from regulators, from policymakers. CO2 monitoring, that's important. We started the work because we said, the work on emissions, we said we need to monitor CO2 in order to be able to manage them, to bring them down. And the problem with monitoring is that you need good data. You need to look at your operations, you need to know what's happening, how many kilometers you have driven or sailed, how much fuel you have used, and all this sort of data that perhaps not everybody is collecting at the moment and not in the same way. Lastly, regulatory uncertainty. That is linked to the fact that we do have a guideline now to calculate and report on emissions, but before we produced that, it was not there. So you could just go on Google and see what standards were produced up to that moment, and maybe you would read them and you would say, I don't understand it. It doesn't make sense for my company, for my operations. So we start from the assumption that you need to measure in order to manage. And we have seen the different reasons for which emissions calculation is important. Again, it is not for just for collecting some numbers and having some figures. Ultimately, you need to bring those emissions down. You will understand what's your carbon footprint, what's your impact on the environment. You are also required to report and to calculate and report because there are regulations, legislations coming up which will require you to do it, and some modes of transport are already required to do so. There is a market demand, right? We also, I think the buzzword since a few years is sustainability, green. We will see if that continues, but there is a demand on having more sustainable options. By monitoring your CO2, you can also identify operational improvements and reduce costs eventually. And also you are able to envisage proactively what risks you are going towards and manage them. A few figures about emissions in general. You can see that worldwide, transport accounts for 14%, or will account for 14% of the global emissions. That's worldwide. I can tell you that at EU level, transport accounts for 25% of the emissions. So in the EU, the transport sector is accountable for 1/4 of the emissions in the EU. Here, this means, this 14% basically means 8 billions. And you can see that the automotive industry, according to a report by the World Economic Forum, the automotive industry accounts for 3.7 billion tons of the emissions, and all that has to do with transportation emissions lies somewhere in between these two. Of course, we don't know how much it is because we're not measuring it properly. We can imagine. Earlier in my slide, I also mentioned, we've seen in the previous slide environmental impacts, so numbers, how many emissions are we producing in the transport sector and so on. We also said that there's the regulation perspective. So we can see that we have legislation which is requiring you to calculate and report on emissions. The most pragmatic one that we see is ETS, the European trading system, which applies to maritime. So a lot of you in the room are familiar with it. You have to calculate on your emissions, you have to report on it, and you have to pay if you don't if you're not within certain limits. But you also have, as of this year, the CSRD. We'll speak about that in a minute. And since last year, in the EU, there is a proposal for a new legislation, which is called the Count Emissions EU regulation. And that's basically establishing a European framework for calculating and reporting on emissions. First of all, I must tell you that our guideline is compliant with it. So we expect that it will all be in line. So if you calculate with our guideline, then you will follow also the European principles. But that's still in development. Lawmaking at EU level takes some time. Also at national level, that's pretty clear. Then you have normative frameworks. ISO 14083, it's an example, and before that, and still ongoing, the GHG protocol. These are helping companies to comply with new legislation. And then you have application frameworks. So further guidelines like ours, who are supporting companies to ensure proper implementation, to have data and be sure that emissions are calculated. I would just say regarding the Count Emissions EU, the last thing that I want to mention is that it will not be mandatory. As far as we know, we will see how the negotiations on the file will progress. But what we also see, in ECG, I'm also responsible for EU affairs since a couple of years. So what I see is that a lot of the times regulation that comes into place at EU level, then it's used, maybe it's not mandatory, but then it's used as a reference in other pieces of legislations. So effectively making it mandatory. I mentioned earlier the CSRD, and I told you that we would be looking into it more deeply. You know that corporate sustainability is one concept, and it includes also the environmental part with emissions calculation and reporting, but also the social aspect and many other aspects. But this CSRD is real, and you can see here that scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are included already in the reporting, meaning you need to calculate them. And they will start applying for almost all type of companies in the next years. So 2024 is the first reporting year. Companies who have more than 500 employees will have to report in 2025 about their 2024 data. And we know that in our membership, we have a lot of companies which are not large EU companies, but they are SMEs. So, you know, a lot of our members are in between these two categories. You will also have to do that in the next years. And we know how complicated it is for SMEs to implement certain processes. The message here is that you have to be ready. If that was not convincing enough, here are some examples of what will happen. So normally the EU produces the law, so either it applies directly in the member states, but this CSRD is a directive, so member states have to transpose it, so they have to develop their own national law and decide on penalties, for example. And we already know what is coming, what penalties are coming in some countries, like Italy, Ireland, Germany. Here are a few examples. I hope I didn't scare you too much. So now let's move to some key factors that we saw as problematic when we started to work on this topic. First, data availability. So maybe you have different systems, different softwares, you have data. Maybe you have to put it together though in a certain way, retrieve it. So data availability, first you need to have the data and then you have to use it. And that's hard specifically for SMEs once again. Lack of standardization. So as I said, there were, before our guideline, there were some general rules about how to calculate and how to report, but there was no standard way to do it. When we started the project, we surveyed our members and we asked them, are your customers asking you for emissions data? And they said, I think more than 50% of them already back in 2020 were asking about emissions data. And they all said that all the customers were doing it in different ways. So there was no standard way for our members to use to then report data to the customers. Data exchange. That's also part of the standardization, as I mentioned. Maybe companies were calculating emissions data in different ways, and then they also had to report it in different ways to their customers, via email, Excel, via the actual format. And also there was no clear responsibility on who should do what exactly should you communicate. Should you communicate the emissions per car, per kilometer, per whatever? Don't worry, we have we have the responses to all these key factors that we have identified as problematic. Complexity, vehicle logistics in general is a very complex I would say, sector. Technological barriers. I saw throughout the years that a lot of our members hired sustainability managers, or it requires resource, it requires extra work, also extra development of appropriate tools where you can put together the data that you have from your TMS and then do the proper calculations. Lastly, guess what? The cost. It has come at a cost. So this is what we found, but then we would like to ask you to please take again out your phones and rank these key factors. So what do you see as most challenging? This is cost. So let us know. What is the key factor for you or for those 39% who do good emissions calculations? Lack of standardization as number one. I don't think that's an option anymore with our guideline, right? So yeah, data availability, complexity. Thank you. But maybe we haven't thought enough. Maybe there are some other challenges that you see. Can you mention and let us know which are other challenges that you see with regard to this topic? Oh. Laziness, okay. Privacy, okay. I guess that's linked to the sharing of maybe sensitive data or commercially sensitive data at times. Mindset, very interesting. Time, lack of experts in calculation. Stakeholders engagement. Accuracy, yeah. Do we have enough to shape our work in the next months? I think so. Okay, thank you very much. So that was it for the first module. I hope this was an introduction to what's also about to follow. We are going now into module 2 of this training. Therefore, I would like to invite here Stefan Doch, ITCL. He will, I mentioned him already, if you want to introduce yourself, Stefan, and take us through module 2 of this training.
Thank you, Andrea, for the comprehensive introduction. So, hello also from my side. Happy to see you all in the training. Yeah, let's right step in. So I'm speaking today, but I just wanted to add on what Andrea said at the beginning. Beside the faces you have seen in the introduction slide, there was a whole group of industry people, yeah, from different service providers and mode of transport involved into preparing those training slides. and tried to cover the different perspectives and starting points, yeah, that companies from different sectors, from different mode of transports, from different sizes have as a starting point in the discussion. So I think that's an important background to note. In my first session today, that's a very light introduction, to be honest. Yeah, before going into more details in the afternoon, I want, and I liked on the previous poll that beside all content-related questions we have, yeah, like data accuracy and privacy and standardization and so on, the mindset change, yeah, was one of the key aspects that were named here in the audience. And the objective of this initial introduction is that we discuss or being aware again on what are the key principles and objectives we dealt in our industry group with when developing this guideline. And that is also the key aspect to understand and to know for you when applying it internally in your companies, that you be aware of that and also promote exactly this mindset and this key aspects we want to change when doing the implementation work internally. So two main learning objectives therefore is, what are really the benefits we want to address with it? Yeah, because there's always the question, isn't there enough available already? And what are the key aspects we want to make different? Before going on the additional points on those slides, just for reflecting for all of you, yeah? A lot of you, I think, are close to all this emission calculation topic in logistics. Yeah? So can you remember when the predecessor of the ISO standard was developed? So that's European Standard EN 16258. 50. Just. Huh? So the initial draft, that was where I also was involved, yeah, during my time as a researcher at the university, was 2010. Yeah? So that's nearly 15 years ago that the topic of standardizing emission calculations in the logistics sector was addressed. And if you look into the real content piece of the old standard, the predecessor ISO, and also the content part of the ECG VDA guideline, that's all the same. Yeah? In a nutshell, that's all the same. So you could argue on a very high level, it's a solved problem. Yeah? It's a solved problem. Yeah? There's nothing new. All major key aspects, at least, yeah? How to understand something, how to standardize something, how to calculate something, how to set the scope, the boundaries. That's discussed, yeah, since years. That's a solved problem. But we are standing here together for an initial discussion on what is the benefit of standardizing emission calculation in the logistics industry. So where does that come from? So why are we standing here? So think about that. So, and now the world, of course, gets more complicated, more hands-on, more real life, yeah? It's perhaps not that easy, like it sounds in theory. And if we perhaps follow the path since 2010, so what can we observe in the industry? So let's perhaps first look on the customer side, yeah? So automotive OEMs. So what did they do? Well, all of them have, of course, implemented a comprehensive full scope of scope 1 and 2 and 3 reporting in their companies. A few of them sooner than others, but whatever, it's available, right? Okay. What did the logistics service providers do? Perhaps at the beginning, nothing, I would assume, yeah? And later on, perhaps, there were perhaps different ambition levels from your stakeholders, from your owners, from the ability to do something. There are larger players in your industry. There are smaller ones that do not have a corporate sustainability team available. Sure, they do not have. But to what situation did that lead? So I would summarize that a decoupled world, yeah, in the automotive and logistics service provider industry. So what do I mean with decoupled? Customers did their thing, I would summarize. Yeah? They did their calculation. They said, well, the world is clear. I have standards I can rely on, where I get my stamp from my auditors for. So easy stuff. I can model my world in logistics internally. Perhaps sometimes I ask my service providers a few questions. When did you bought your last truck? Can I have a few details on a few routings? But in general, the word was, okay, customers did their thing, asked a few questions, and there was the logistics service provider world. So a decoupled situation. And now we are shifting all of that. And we are coming to that later when we are discussing the key changes that came with the ISO standard, but also in a, I would say, more practical, more step-by-step approach with our ECG-VDA guideline, is to bringing those two worlds back together. Meaning the key understanding, well, only the ones who are operating logistics can of course evaluate how the process works, what the efficiency level is, what the emission level is, and that is the truth that of course the customer wants to know, needs to be confronted with, and what creates a benefit, of course, in terms of more accuracy, a more realistic picture, a better deep dive understanding where the measures are, and so on. So that is the starting point of all of that. And that is the key idea of making this next step of standardization. Now you could, of course, argue there are enough standards already available. And I would say, in general, yes, they are. But you need, of course, to ask the question, what do they really solve from a practical manner? So from a compliance side, yeah, I would always agree. From a practical side, when we are discussing this shift I was talking about earlier, in responsibility, so making the shift in the industry that transport operators take the responsibility, the accountability for transport emission calculation and reporting, then of course we need to create a few prerequisites. And that is of course the key aspect that this guideline addresses. So it doesn't invite the wheel new in terms of how something is calculated, but it creates an equal playing field and a fair playing field in how exactly is it applied. And that is a key prerequisite to allow everything I have told you before. So to allow a trustworthy environment where logistics service provider on the one hand side are willing to share emission calculation results with their companies, because everybody thinks on points that you have seen in the poll before. What is the consequence of when I'm reporting the one thing and my competitor is reporting something else? So do I have a disadvantage by that? And yes, of course, you could have. So therefore, it's of course very important if you shift the responsibility to the industry that you are creating clear rules. So that's, I think, a very important point. And that is what the key idea of this guideline is. And well, when I was yesterday evening sitting in the hotel and preparing for today's session, I asked my good friend Perplexity on what is different in the ECG VDA guideline. And there the key answer of my companion AI was, it aims to provide transparency and accountability for reporting in the industry. And I think that's a very wise word, yeah, that the accountability setup needs to be clear. Yeah? That, yeah, of course, for government bodies, yeah, for legal requirements, of course, yeah, a customer, an OEM, has a responsibility. But in terms of the transport operation that happens and the result out of that, yeah, the accountability is in the industry. So and therefore, that needs to be clear and standardized, and that was the key objective. So then you come, of course, to other questions, follow-up questions. Would you be able to do that? I would say yes, it's a simple resource question at the end. If you have the resources internally at the logistics service provider, I can buy 2 well-educated sustainability managers, and I'm an ambitious owner of a logistics service provider. I would say, well, yes, yeah, that's easily done. But, of course, that's not the situation, of course, you could assume for being the starting point at every company in the logistics service provider industry. So therefore, of course, we need to create a solution that lowers the entry point of implementing it in companies. That is meant with dissemination, knowledge transfer, and so on. And that, of course, comes to a certain end. Yeah? Neither myself or an IT provider or whoever can take the task for you, all of you, to do it. Yeah? But we can, of course, lower the entry barriers a lot compared to the situation we started with perhaps a few years ago. And that is the key aspect that we are addressing. And now you would ask the question, okay, but at the end, margins in the industry are small, and that's all, again, an additional add-on of new processes, new efforts, new overheads, whatever. Where's the win-win situation here? And the win-win situation is if you, and that is something we are discussing in the next minutes, also in a small group work, if you are looking on the different stakeholder perspectives, yeah, that do exist. If you're looking on the customer side, what will you see? Okay, today you will see barriers up. I'm modeling my world, yeah, because I can't compare service provider 1 against 2, so therefore I create an equal playing field by doing it my own. Okay, fair. Why is that the case? Of course, because from a customer perspective, it's a huge complexity driver to integrate all the suppliers he has in terms of emission calculation and reporting. In terms of the method, how it's calculated, simply the task of data transfer, the question of validation of results, make them comparable, managing them internally in a well-structured approach. So therefore, of course, a customer would have a win-win, or the first win, a win for him if it is achieved that there is an efficiency gain through standardization on what he gets and wants. There's one customer, multiple suppliers. And then you are switching your perspective. Tobias has a question.
Yeah, I think everything you're saying is valid.
Correct. Yeah.
I think it sounds, at least from my perspective, bigger than it is. And I think from at least my little narrow perspective, what I would like to see is if you have the same set of tricks, I would like the same results every time. So, and when two competitors bid for the same contract, my main goal is that the emission figures are comparable, and that I can call in an auditor, for instance, and check if the calculations are right. So that's a really narrow perspective from a competitive situation, why it's really important to have standardized a standardized method. But everything Stefan is saying is valid.
Right.
I think it sounds, maybe from my perspective, it's fairly simple. That's why.
Yeah. So, and then you have, of course, the logistics service provider perspective, and I think the ones that deal with customer requests on sustainability in the last years, you have seen that, of course, you do not have a uniform request from the customer side. Yeah. So you're coming, of course, from a situation where you try to meet individual reporting and information requests. Yeah? And these two perspectives were brought together here, and that is the key advantage that we try to solve out of this work situation where both parties of the industry join together to bring those two perspectives together. So of course, all that comes with a cost. Yeah? So I always say standards or guidelines are one of the fastest depreciating assets you could have. Yeah? The moment you publish it, they are of course not up to date anymore. Yeah? Because you have experiences out of the industry in applying it real life. You have new background information that come in. You have underlying standards that are updated. So, of course, that comes with a cost. Yeah, that comes of an organizational cost. So the ones that are managing a guideline, a standard, keeping it up to date. And that comes, of course, always with a cost at your side, yeah, in terms of updating your methodology. But at the end, it's a beneficial situation, yeah, because that's only done once. So the other point, what the guideline addresses, and I think that's something to very much mention is it's not only the internal calculation and the responsibility setup, yeah? It's the way the data exchange is done. Because that is coming out of a very Excel, very one-to-one communication-like practice. And that is, of course, not a scalable situation you have. Yeah, that is something you can do perhaps with your key suppliers, or that is something you can do in pilots. But that's not something you can scale, yeah, over the whole process. So therefore, a key result, which was also created in cooperation with Odette, is that really the data exchange itself is standardized. And it is closely related to all EDI message, the finished vehicle logistics specific standards that exist, that is really compliant to this logic. Yeah? You have transactions, and you have status updates of transactions. And an emission is nothing else. Yeah, that's at the end nothing else than a drop-off notification. It's an additional information that you get, yeah, but it is nothing else than the usual transport status updates and so on you're practicing today. And that's the way we want to see it, yeah, that it's nothing special, yeah, that it's integrated into the process and the practices, and by that achieving a certain level, a higher level of scalability in the industry. So that is perhaps what the key ideas behind this standardization practice are, and I think that are also the ones you should keep in mind. Yeah, when doing internal implementation, internal discussion, what is the key it can achieve, it wants to achieve, but also what is out of scope at the end. So, out of the situation that it was and still is, yeah, and you see it in the room, yeah, it is still an industry collaboration, yeah, between customers and service providers. And I think that was one of the largest success factors, and it still is. Because only by that you create, of course, a high level of industry acceptance. Because everything that I mentioned as a problem situation at the beginning, at the end is a chicken-egg problem, yeah? Who starts? So therefore, I think it was a wise decision not to searching for someone who starts, doing it synced together. So therefore, that is one of the hugest benefits. Then we, of course, dealt very much with result accuracy. And you have seen that also in one of the polls of Andrea. Data availability and data accuracy still, yeah, are one of the evergreens, yeah, I would say, of emission calculation and reporting, especially in transport operations. So I will not, of course, summarize what are the reasons for that. I think that's something you all know. Yeah, there are, of course, a lot of reasons. Yeah, that has to do with subcontracting businesses, that has to do with company size, that has to do with the level of standardization a transport operation could have, and so on. Yeah, I think that's nothing we need to discuss here again, but this question of accuracy is really important, and that's not a scientific, a theoretical question. Yeah? I think that's the important thing. It's not, well, I have the ambition to make something a few % more accurate. nicer in terms of the result. Yeah, that's not the key question here. The key question is, what level of accuracy do you need to achieve your goals? Yeah, and achieving your goals is what we have discussed earlier. So one key goal was, of course, acceptance. Yeah, is it accepted by the customer? So therefore, it has also something to do with providing a benefit into using default values, for example, or modeling something out of assumed information. So therefore, of course, achieving an accuracy gain in the results is a key benefit, yeah, that you can market to the customer side. Then, of course, it has to do with this old story of you can't manage what you can't measure. So, of course, there are, in the world when you are working with modeled information, with default values at the customer side, there is a limit. There is a limit of results out of measures you have taken to see it in results. Yeah? And that is, of course, something that counteracts situation when you need to internally market against money for sustainability measures and so on. So therefore, of course, also this accuracy gain is, from this perspective, an important perspective. So then, and I think that's something that is not fully obvious if you read the guideline in its current state, as I understood everybody did in a certain perspective. That is comparability. So I think we have discussed comparability in terms of equal playing field practices. Yeah? So a result from one service provider is in a certain way comparable to another. The other thing is comparability throughout the whole life cycle of a transport operating contract. And that was discussed, and that is one of the founding ideas of the guideline. As you see, it doesn't mention it in a detailed process at the moment. Yeah? So at the moment, it doesn't cover how do I do tender calculation, for example. Yeah? But the basis is exactly designed a way that the practice of defining your transport operation, segmenting your transport operation in certain uniform clusters, and then using this design with different calculation methods that are applicable in the different phases of a contract. Yeah, of course, you can't do a calculation out of primary data when you are just discussing on a new transport concept in a new contract. Yeah, but that is exactly the idea, that there's a pathway throughout the whole life cycle, yeah, of a customer contract, and that the method itself, yeah, so the underlying structure and idea can be applied throughout all phases. And I think that is one of the most important points that is a barrier for implementation today, yeah, because you are always thinking, okay, the customer wants a certain information from my side, how things will work out later on when I'm operating. And therefore, I think that's very important, and the standard is designed that way, and that will work out, yeah, in the next versions, that we will, of course, standardize also these different practices, that calculating a design, reporting on how it happened, and also calculating on scenarios of improvement. Yeah? That is, for example, if you discuss with your customer, for example, an alternative fuel. Yeah, there it's very important that it's linked to the emission calculation, that those are not two separate worlds. Yeah, on the one hand side, you are doing reporting. On the other hand side, you are saying, well, I can sell you a certificate on something. And that is how it's done partially today. Yeah, that's a real issue, that measures, reduction measures, book and claim practices are often not linked into the emission calculation and reporting world, that there's two separate worlds. And that is bringing it together, that is fully compliant with this practice, and therefore one of the main application areas also in the future. That you can have, I have a scenario in my default configuration of a transport, and there, it doesn't matter what it is. It can be conventional fuel, it can be conventional propulsion type, it can be conventional mode of transport, and I have an alternative setup. Alternative fuel, alternative propulsion type, shifting something to modal split rail or inland waterway, whatever. And I have really the comparison of what is the saving behind it. Yeah? That you really have that in the calculation and reporting style the guideline is designed for. And all of that, of course, tries to align and strengthen the way the processing of information and data is done, and that is something I do not want to deep dive into today very much, because that is the key of tomorrow's deep dive sessions, yeah, where you have really hands-on experiences in proper case studies, real-life examples, how the processing, what the lessons learned, the best practices in processing information and data are. So therefore, I do not want to stress that too much. So I think the link to tenders, to prices, to commercial agreements, to insetting practices, and so on, I have already mentioned. Yeah, I think at the end, that's the key motivation behind the guideline. That are the key aspects that you need to ask yourself when you are implementing practices. And yeah, we will go into more detail of that. So after the break, I will of course go into more details on the method basis itself. I do want to stress at one example the accuracy aspect, or also the tailoring aspect of this guideline. Why is it important to do something specifically for the automotive industry? And to be honest, that's not only true for the automotive industry. That also applies to the chemical industry or other industry that have a certain level of specifics in terms of the product characteristics, in terms of the operations, and so on. So there are a lot of detailed aspects that we could discuss here, but we want to stress only one very straightforward thing. That is how to deal with transport mass informations. So I think that is, the background is nothing I need to explain to all of you. Yeah? That at the end, emissions are linked to transport activity. So distances and masses transported, sure. And that the importance of mass, of course, differs between the physics of mode of transports. That it has a closer relation, of course, on road transportation than on the maritime side, on the rail side. I think that's straightforward and clear as well. I think what is not so clear is how to deal with it. Because there you need to differentiate different perspectives. So one is when you are asking the question, what is the emission level of a transport? There, everything you see on the slide doesn't matter. Because, of course, physics are not different in automotive logistics than in other sectors. Yeah? Of course, still the emission intensity is related to the transport activity. Sure. But as soon as you are in a situation where you have an allocation question to customers, or within one customer to car models, you could ask yourself the question, is the general recommendation something should be mass-based? Right. And then, I mean, you all come from the industry, I do not need to explain to you that the loading factor of a truck, for example, is not only limited by its mass, that it is also limited by its volume or the number of cars you can transport, for example, and the same also is relevant for rail and for ro-ro car carriers. I think that is known by you, but that you are coming to an allocation question. Yeah? And that is a question that other transport sectors do not have in that kind. You can see it in the containerized world, but there it's simple. Why is it simple? Okay, because all containers are Toyota Corollas. Yeah? There is only one. One dimension size, yeah, you can standardize everything in 20-foot container equivalents, so therefore that's getting easy. Yeah, and then perhaps you have those situations, perhaps in something like the parcel industry and so on, but not in that specific manner as we see it in the automotive sector. So therefore that's only one example of where is this additional gain in accuracy needed in terms of focusing on one specific industrial sector. Yeah? So that is the key idea. And that is one of the examples in dealing with that. So how all this calculation works is coming in the next module. That is only the idea why that should be addressed. So if we are proceeding, we are coming, of course, to area of application, and I think area of application we have already discussed very well. And that is a thing that I think everybody of you should take with you, yeah, on the service provider side when doing implementation practices. So I know a lot of you, of course, have emission calculation practices in place. So I can tell you a story, of course, without names of who it was. So I was 2 weeks ago at a meeting at one logistics service provider, so medium size. Had a meeting with the owner and the operations manager. And there was the question, Stefan, I want to start a project for marketing my emission results to the customers. And there I already had a problem with the question, yeah? To be honest. So, and what is the learning out of that? Yeah, you can think about your own, yeah, what are the issues with that question, but what is the learning at the end? What do you take with you? So taking with you is you need to address the whole chain of applications. It doesn't make sense to market something or to report something or to being able to calculate something in a tender, or to have an internal, very nice process in calculating what is the eco-efficiency of certain practices, yeah, in improving your operations alone. That only makes sense if the whole chain of these application areas are implemented together, yeah? Because only with that you are getting an authentic result. It doesn't make sense being able to calculate something for tenders without being able to fulfill reporting requests from your customer at the end. It doesn't make sense to report on results without being able to provide options in improving to a customer, yeah, including the possibility to calculate on those scenarios. So I think that's the important takeaway, that you always need to implement it end to end, yeah, starting with the beginning, and the end result is reporting, yeah. And I think that's the key takeaway in this session. Before we are summarizing, we want to introduce a small interactive part. I know that's perhaps a bit hard with that many people, but I think all of you are able to do it. The interactive part comes back to the starting point of what I discussed with you earlier. What are customers asking for today? And there, a few of the logistics service providers that were involved in the preparation group of this training were so kind and handed over a few of their tender documents. And that is, of course, very summarized, but that are the wordings that are asked there. So there is something like, it is needed that you provide an emission factor. I mean, in the first instance, if you are not in the topic, I think that sounds not too unreasonable, yeah, but those are questions that are being asked. And there you see, I think, very good what we have discussed together in the introduction, that one of the key aspects of the standardization we need to tackle is the customer LSP interface, yeah, from both perspectives, from both sides. Because, of course, what you see here is, of course, unclear in definition. It's different wordings for the same thing. It's different levels of aggregation. The scope is unclear. The level of aggregation in detail is unclear. Yeah, so everything is unclear. Yeah, so you can I think you can answer what you want. Yeah? And then we just screened a bit those tender documents on what are additional informations, yeah, customers are requesting for. And that is perhaps version 2 of this old, how old is your truck question, yeah? I don't know if you know that, yeah? That's, I think, the key point. Yeah, Michael, you are laughing. Yeah, that's the key point. Yeah, you have seen in the last years. So initial starting point, yeah, of a customer. Well, yeah, I need to transport the information to my suppliers that sustainability is important for me. The result out of that was asking, what is the average age of your truck fleet? Okay, so now we have a more advanced set of questions we see, and a lot of them are alternative propulsion type, alternative fuel-based, so is it possible, is it operated, is it used? And I think Andrea has shown that, so that is something I have explained earlier, yeah, that we are very compliant to this possibility to evaluate options. Yeah, it's all of that scenario calculation ability. And we try to specifically address and book and claim process best practice in the next version of the guideline, because that is exactly dealing with this topic that is now coming in all of the tenders. And there we need to sort the situation out, I would summarize. Okay, so we have all of that in mind. So what do we want to achieve? What are the benefits? What are the different stakeholder perspectives? We want to invite you into summarizing discussions you could have on your table. So we have more or less tables with 4 people each. So that's a very nice coincidence, because we are doing a small role-playing game with 4 different perspectives. So you could be procurement. So those are the guys that always ask, they always answer it's not possible, yeah, when offering an alternative fuel solution or operation, or you are discussing with an LSP if it's possible to have a longer contract duration for electric truck implementation, something like that. You could be the sustainability manager at the customer side. I think that's the easiest role you could have in the room, because they only want the best. You could be the LSP key account manager, and you could be the sustainability manager, who is the one who makes all the magic happen internally. Yeah? And we want to invite you that you perhaps, do not make it too complicated, stay in the room, having a not too noisy discussion, perhaps at your table, in perhaps those 4 roles. You can also swap role, you do not need to be OEM today if you are the rest of your life. And perhaps have a discussion if you step into the perspective of each stakeholder, have a quick discussion, what do I want? What do I want from my other stakeholders on the table? What can I provide? What I'm willing to provide? And then perhaps come to a joint conclusion. What do you learn out of that? I think you know all about that. Yeah, that's one of the key methods, in the agile management, that you try to change perspective, to change stakeholder perspective, and that's also what we are doing here. Just as a quick breakout, what are your learnings? And for those learnings, there's a Slido poll on the next slide, and simply type in a few summarizing words in terms of what are the barriers and the success factors you have learned out of your quick discussion. We have 10 minutes. I think Andrea is telling us when 10 minutes is over. And feel free, enjoy, have fun, be the role you want to.